The bank was quiet, filled with the soft clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of finance. A man in dusty work boots stepped up to the counter, his accent heavy, his hands calloused, holding a worn envelope. Two employees glanced at each other and smirked. One whispered something. The other laughed. Probably cashing $100 check, someone muttered behind the glass. But when the man opened the envelope, the room fell silent. Inside were certified documents, wire instructions, and account numbers from an international transfer. He wasn't depositing money. He was buying the building. Because the man they mocked wasn't just a customer, he was the new owner's representative. And in that moment, everyone in the room learned exactly why appearances should never be trusted. Under the relentless midday sun of a small Californian town, the heat pressed down on sidewalks and rooftops alike, curling the edges of flyers pinned to lampposts and shimmering in the air like a mirage. Inside the cool, glass-paneled lobby of Pinebridge Financial, the atmosphere was one of practiced calm. The marble floors gleamed, air conditioning hummed in the background, and the faint click of polished shoes on tile echoed as customers came and went. Tellers behind the counter smiled politely, dressed in matching navy blazers and crisp white shirts. A quiet buzz of professionalism hung in the air, sterile and controlled. At precisely 1:47 p.m., the front doors swung open and in walked a man who instantly disrupted the quiet rhythm. He wasn't loud. He didn't move quickly or make a scene. But he didn't fit. That was obvious from the moment he stepped in. His boots were dusty, scuffed at the edges from work. His jeans bore faint streaks of dried paint, and his shirt, pressed but plainly worn, marked him as someone who labored with his hands. His skin was tanned from hours in the sun. His black mustache was neat and his eyes alert. He carried a small black backpack slung over one shoulder and walked with the slow, steady gait of someone who didn't rush without reason. His name was Raul Mendoza, and he had come to open an account. Behind the counters, two young tellers exchanged glances. Not malicious, but knowing. The kind of glance that precedes a joke. One of them straightened up, forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and greeted Raul with that tone reserved for people you expect not to understand. Overly clear. A little loud. The way someone speaks to a tourist or a child. Raul responded calmly in perfect English. His voice was deep and clear. No accent. No confusion. Just quiet confidence. But even then, she asked him to repeat himself twice before gesturing toward the waiting area, telling him a banker would assist him shortly. Raul nodded and took a seat. The lobby wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered around, some checking phones, others filling forms. A man in a suit across the room glanced up, saw Raul, and returned to his tablet. A woman nearby shifted her purse slightly, adjusting it on her lap. Raul didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't let it show. He folded his hands over his knee and waited patiently, eyes resting on the rows of financial brochures on the far wall. From behind the glass door of one of the private banker offices, another exchange took place. A senior banker, trim and balding, leaned over and whispered something to a colleague. She smiled, stifled a chuckle, and rolled her eyes. Raul saw none of this. But the receptionist caught it. Her eyes darted back toward him, guilt flickering in her expression. She adjusted her headset and tapped something into her keyboard. After nearly 20 minutes, the receptionist finally called out Raul's name. He stood, approached, and was directed to Office 2, where the senior banker, Mr. Daniels, waited. Mr. Daniels didn't rise to greet him. He offered a quick nod, motioned to the chair, and asked how he could help. Raul explained that he wanted to open a new business account. Daniels raised an eyebrow. What kind of business? He asked. Raul answered evenly. A construction firm. Sole proprietorship. Expanding into a small team. He had ID, proof of address, all necessary documentation. He began to pull them from his folder, carefully organized and paper-clipped. Daniels barely looked at the documents before asking a pointed question about Raul's income. Then another about where the startup funds were coming from. Then one about citizenship. None of these questions were out of line, technically, but they came with a tone, a doubt, a silent interrogation not extended to every customer. Raul answered them all patiently, calmly, but as he did, he noticed the tone, the glance, the subtle smile playing at the corners of Daniel's mouth. Behind them, through the glass wall, another banker walked by, glanced in, and smirked. Raul saw that too. The meeting dragged. Daniels insisted on verifying more than was needed. He stepped out to check something, leaving Raoul waiting alone in the small glass box of an office, exposed and observed. From outside, the tellers looked over again. One of them laughed quietly and turned away. A man seated nearby saw the entire exchange. He frowned. His hand hovered over his phone. The receptionist watched too. Her jaw tightened. Raoul stayed still. His eyes didn't show anger, but they didn't blink either. He had walked through doors like these before. He had seen these looks before. He had been underestimated before. But he also knew that moments like these, small as they seemed, were turning points. Quiet fractures in polished walls. When Daniels returned, he was holding a printed form. He offered it to Raoul with a rehearsed apology. Some error in the paperwork, a delay in processing, a need to come back another day. Raoul accepted the paper, folded it once, stood up slowly, and met Daniel's eyes. No complaint, no scene, just a nod. But there was a shift, a quiet one, and it started not with Raoul, but with the people around him who had watched and now understood they'd witnessed something they couldn't unsee. As Raoul walked toward the exit, a sound broke the lobby's sterile hush. The sound of a phone unlocking, followed by a flash. A bystander, seated silently the whole time, had recorded part of the conversation through the glass. Another pulled out their phone too, not for drama, but for documentation. The air changed. Guilt crept across the receptionist's face. One of the tellers turned pale. Daniels stepped into the lobby, looking concerned now. But Raoul didn't stop. He walked out the same way he came in, steady, quiet, dignified. And behind him, the room was no longer so comfortable. Something unspoken had cracked. And within that silence, the weight of the moment finally settled on everyone left behind. The lobby of the downtown branch of Westway National Bank was filled with the muffled hum of voices, the occasional ding of the service queue system, and the rustle of designer handbags and winter coats. The air inside was artificially cool and smelled faintly of leather, cologne, and the sterile undertone of disinfectant that clung to polished marble floors and laminated surfaces. Sunlight streamed in through tall, smudgeless windows, bouncing off brushed chrome details, creating a sense of immaculate order. Every element was designed to communicate prestige, calm, and control. It was a place built to reassure one kind of customer and quietly intimidate another. Raphael stepped into this environment with steady, deliberate steps. He wore dark work boots still dusted from the construction site, well-pressed but plainly cut trousers, and a thick navy hoodie layered over a faded t-shirt. His hands were large, strong, calloused from years of manual labor. His eyes were sharp, watchful, taking in everything, not out of suspicion, but out of the practiced habit of a man who had learned to read the room before the room read him. He held an envelope under one arm and a folded paper in his hand. He moved toward the reception desk with quiet purpose. The woman behind it, a young blonde with a name tag reading Mallory, looked up with a polite smile that flickered ever so slightly when she registered his appearance. Her eyes dropped to his boots, lingered on the faint dirt at the edges of his soles, then darted back to his face with a smile that tightened. She asked how she could help, her voice neutral, crisp. Raphael spoke calmly, in perfect English, with the faint trace of an accent he never tried to hide. He explained that he needed to speak with someone about a large transfer and possibly a private consultation. Mallory blinked, then smiled a little too brightly, as if unsure whether to take him seriously. She asked if he had an account at the bank. He said yes. She asked him to wait and pressed a button on the intercom. As he turned to find a seat, Raphael heard the low murmur of her voice speaking into the receiver, followed by a faint chuckle. He didn't need to hear the exact words. He recognized the tone. From across the lobby, 3 men in tailored suits stood by the glass door to the executive offices. One of them looked over, eyebrows rising. Another smirked. One made a low comment the others laughed at. Raphael caught it only in fragments. Something about contractors getting bold these days. He sat down in the leather waiting chair and quietly unfolded the paper he'd brought with him. It was a notarized document issued from a real estate law office the week prior, and above the signature line, bold capital letters identified him as the managing partner of a private construction and property firm. One that held 6 rental properties, 3 commercial leases, and, as of last week, full ownership of the building this bank branch currently occupied. The irony hadn't been lost on him. He had come to this particular branch because it was the closest to the newly acquired asset. The bank was leasing the space, a long-term agreement renewed annually. He had inherited that contract when he closed the deal on the building, and today, he had come not only to transfer a large amount of capital into a new account, but to inform the bank manager of upcoming structural assessments required for property insurance. But that part, he had decided, could wait until after he saw how they treated him without knowing who he was. A receptionist returned, gesturing to him with a clipped nod. She directed him toward one of the glass-walled consultation rooms. Raphael followed her calmly. The men in suits watched with raised eyebrows, exchanging looks. One whispered something and smirked again. Inside the room, he was greeted by an assistant branch manager who shook his hand without standing and asked for his account number with a tone of impatience poorly masked as professionalism. Raphael provided it. The manager's expression froze as he scanned the information on his screen. His tone shifted slightly. He asked if the amount being transferred was personal or business. Raphael said business, and that he was moving funds in preparation for new renovations to the property. "Which property?" the manager asked, distracted as he typed. Raphael gave the address. The manager stopped typing. He looked up. His smile returned, this time tighter. He asked, just to confirm, "You're with the construction firm working on that site?" Raphael nodded slowly, then reached into his folder and pulled out the deed transfer. He slid it across the table with quiet precision. "No," he said, "I own the site." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. The manager cleared his throat. He glanced back down at the document, then to the monitor. Everything now matched. The name, the signature, the LLC, the federal tax ID. All of it led to the man sitting in front of him in a dusty hoodie and boots. Raphael didn't gloat. He didn't lean back in triumph or smirk the way the men in suits had when he walked in. He simply waited, his hands calmly folded over the envelope in his lap. Outside the glass wall, the men in suits were still watching, though one now looked puzzled. Another pulled out his phone. The manager cleared his throat again, smiled stiffly, and asked if he'd like coffee or tea while the paperwork printed. Raphael declined. He didn't need refreshments. He needed consistency. And today it was already clear that respect in this building was not given until it was forced. He stood quietly as the assistant returned with the contract package and his business card, offered now with 2 hands instead of 1. The branch manager walked him out personally. Mallory at the front desk stood straighter this time. She smiled a little too widely. The suited men averted their eyes. In less than 15 minutes, the atmosphere in the bank had shifted from assumption to apology, all without Raphael raising his voice or pointing out the humiliations. He hadn't needed to. The documents had done the talking, and the shame that followed, though silent, was real. Mateo stood outside the bank for several seconds before stepping through the glass doors. He could still feel the chill of the morning air clinging to his jacket, but it wasn't the cold that slowed his movements. It was everything that this visit represented. He had walked into banks like this before. Not just in this city, but in others: Dallas, Albuquerque, Santa Fe. Each time, the script was almost identical: the looks, the polite smiles that barely hid skepticism, the tone of voice that changed the moment he began to speak, the unspoken question behind every glance: "Why is someone like you here?" The lobby was clean, modern, brightly lit. The floor tiles reflected the ceiling lights in a sterile gleam. A few neatly dressed customers sat in upholstered chairs, flicking through their phones or pretending to read brochures. The scent of fresh coffee hung in the air, mixed with something artificial, maybe the air freshener that mimicked pine or citrus. Mateo walked up to the reception counter, greeted the woman behind the desk, and explained that he was here for his appointment. The receptionist smiled without warmth, then gestured toward the waiting area with a rehearsed motion. Mateo nodded and took a seat, settling into the corner of the room where the sunlight from the large window didn't quite reach. He kept the folder close to him, one hand resting over it as if to protect it from more than just accidental loss. Inside were the documents he had spent weeks gathering: articles of incorporation, business licenses, profit and loss statements, invoices from suppliers, letters of intent from new partners. Every piece of paper told a story. Every number was proof that he had built something real, something that mattered. Something that no one had handed him. Not a bank. Not a government. Not a charity. It was his, brick by brick, day by day. A few minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. Others came in after him, checked in, and were called ahead of him. Mateo noticed. Of course he noticed. It wasn't the first time. Still, he sat quietly, posture straight, eyes calm but alert. He'd learned long ago that responding with frustration only confirmed their suspicions. Better to wait, to let time work in his favor. Eventually, a tall man in a suit appeared at the door to the inner offices. He scanned the room, eyes landing on Mateo with the faintest hesitation before calling his name. The man didn't offer a smile, nor a handshake, just a nod and a gesture to follow. Mateo stood and walked behind him through a narrow hallway into an office with too much glass and not enough warmth. The banker motioned toward a chair but didn't wait for Mateo to sit before turning toward the desk, typing something on his computer. The air in the room was tight. Mateo could feel the unspoken expectations settling like dust on every surface. He pulled out the folder and placed it on the table with care. The banker glanced at it, then at him, and something changed in his expression, just a flicker. He opened it, began to flip through the documents without urgency, as if humoring him. Mateo watched, not speaking, letting the man reach his own conclusions. The numbers didn't lie. The growth curve of the business was impressive even by conservative standards. In 5 years, Mateo had grown his landscaping company from a single borrowed truck and a used lawnmower to a fleet of vehicles, a team of 15 employees, and service contracts with 3 different city departments. The folder included photos, before and after shots of parks he had revitalized, testimonials from city planners, letters of recommendation from satisfied clients. The work was visible, measurable, undeniable. The banker's eyes narrowed as he reached a particular page. A projection showing Mateo's plan to expand into neighboring counties, along with a request for a business credit line to fund new equipment and payroll as contracts scaled up. It was modest compared to what other businesses might ask for. The numbers were sound. The risk was minimal. But still, Mateo saw it, the doubt creeping back into the man's eyes, the calculation behind every pause. Not calculation based on interest rates or repayment timelines, but something else. Something older. Mateo spoke slowly, clearly, letting the words land with precision. He explained the plan, the revenue streams, the projected returns. The banker nodded occasionally but kept his arms crossed, a defensive posture that didn't match the logic on the page. Mateo could sense the undercurrent. He had lived with it all his life. You could call it doubt, you could call it bias, but to Mateo it was always the same, an invisible filter that distorted everything he said, everything he did, through the lens of where he came from, how he looked, what accent he still carried despite 2 decades in the country. The banker asked a few questions, short and pointed. Mateo answered each one without hesitation. The man made a few notes, clicked through some screens, and finally said he'd need to run it by his supervisor. Mateo nodded. Of course. It was never just one person. There was always someone else, some layer of invisible approval that added time, that pushed him just a little further down the line. As Mateo stood to leave, the banker offered a thin smile. It wasn't apology. It wasn't respect. It was the kind of smile that people give when they don't expect to see you again. Mateo returned it with a polite nod, collected his folder, and walked out the same way he came in, steady, quiet, unnoticed. But something had changed. Not in the bank. In him. The hesitation that had lingered earlier that morning was gone. He had seen it again, the script playing out in real time, the assumptions, the dismissals. And he knew what was coming next. He had already made a call the night before. A friend of his, a city council member who had watched Mateo's rise with admiration, had offered help. Not in pushing papers, but in presence. Public presence. Mateo didn't like theatrics, but sometimes when you build something in silence for long enough, you have to make noise to be heard. The next visit to the bank would not be quiet. Not because Mateo would be louder, but because the truth he carried would be too heavy to ignore. The room had grown quiet, though not completely. There was a shifting discomfort, the kind that creeps in slowly when something unexpected unravels the illusion of control. The banker who had smirked just minutes earlier now sat straighter, his posture stiff and uncertain. He glanced at the others, searching for a cue, some nonverbal reassurance that this was still a situation within their grasp. But the glances returned to him were blank, unfocused, caught somewhere between surprise and something heavier, guilt. Mateo did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence had begun to change the room. His modest clothes and sun-worn face told one story, but the papers in his hands told another, far less comfortable tale. It wasn't anger that burned in his eyes, it was clarity. The kind that comes from years of work, from learning to speak through action rather than words, from earning every small dignity in a world that tried to tell him he didn't belong. He stepped closer to the counter, and when he laid the second folder on the desk, the subtle shuffle of people turning in their chairs rippled through the waiting area like a hush before thunder. It wasn't just bank statements anymore. It was documentation, legal, certified, bearing signatures from offices many of those watching had never stepped into. Land deeds, franchise agreements, tax documentation from a business that had expanded across 3 states in the last 5 years. Numbers that spoke in a language the bankers understood better than anything else: profit margins, valuations, growth rates. And there it was in black ink, the name of the company. Not a chain they recognized from TV commercials. Not a brand advertised on glossy billboards. But it was there, real and official. Mateo's name appeared beneath the title as founder and primary shareholder. The older woman from earlier, the one who had laughed softly when he struggled to find the right word in English, now sat with her handbag clutched tight in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. The silence grew awkward as the realization bloomed across faces like a slow, reluctant sunrise. Some looked away. Others stared at the floor. Not because they were being scolded, but because they'd convicted themselves. The branch manager, previously absent, entered with a crisp smile that faltered almost immediately. He saw the body language of the staff, the stack of documents, and the man at the center of it all, Mateo, no longer just a Mexican in overalls and worn boots. He was something else now, something not easy to dismiss. Without asking, the manager walked over to Mateo and extended a hand. There was an air of performative politeness in the gesture, but also something else, a hint of uncertainty. It wasn't clear who the gesture was meant to serve, Mateo or the witnesses still watching. Mateo, for his part, didn't rush to shake it. He looked at the hand, then at the man's face, and allowed just enough pause to let everyone in the room feel the power shift. Then, with a calm nod, he shook it. He spoke softly, his accent still there but now less important. What mattered more was that he spoke fluently, deliberately, and with the assurance of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had grown comfortable in the space between judgment and truth. The manager listened, nodded, and gestured to one of the private offices. A door opened. A chair was offered. The same banker who had once looked at him like an inconvenience now brought him coffee. Mateo didn't gloat. He didn't smile smugly or say, "I told you so." That wasn't his way. He let the facts speak. And facts, in this case, spoke louder than any accent, any assumption, or any momentary smirk. The air in the bank had changed. A lesson had been delivered, not with anger, not with revenge, but with quiet dignity and the undeniable power of a man who built something they never imagined he could. As he sat down, one of the younger tellers, maybe new to the job, whispered to her colleague. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "Did you see the number of employees he has?" The answer was silence again. Not because no one knew what to say, but because words no longer served the people who had spent too long speaking over men like him. By the time Mateo returned to the bank the following week, the story had already begun to circulate. Not in the newspapers, not on television, but in the invisible ways stories travel, through hushed conversations, private group chats, and office whispers. Word had spread that the man who had been brushed off, the one they assumed was there to cash a small check or open a basic savings account, was in fact the owner of one of the fastest-growing service businesses in the region. He hadn't needed to tell anyone. The documents had done the talking. And once they were seen, the people who had once doubted him had started to realize what they had nearly overlooked. Mateo didn't come alone this time. He arrived with two people. One was Carmen, his longtime bookkeeper, a sharp-minded woman in her early 50s who wore glasses low on her nose and carried a laptop case with an air of precision. The other was Luis Mendoza, a respected city council member who had publicly backed Mateo's projects more than once. Luis didn't dress like a politician, no flashy cufflinks or overly tailored suits. But his presence was commanding. He was known in the community, trusted, and very visible. His being there wasn't an accident. Mateo didn't bring him for show. He brought him for balance. A counterweight to the subtle pressure that had always existed in rooms like this. They walked in together, calmly, quietly, as if they belonged there. And they did. The receptionist stood up a little straighter this time. She greeted them with a smile that reached her eyes, which it hadn't done the first time. She asked them to wait just a moment. Not 10 minutes. Not 20. Just a moment. Within 2 minutes, a different banker appeared. This one younger. With a more polished suit and a name badge that said, Senior Account Executive. His handshake was firm, his smile too practiced, but at least he tried to hide his surprise. He gestured for them to follow. The office this time wasn't tucked away in the corner. It was one of the larger ones, with a view of the street and a more comfortable set of chairs. Water was offered immediately, then coffee. Mateo declined. He had learned that hospitality was often a smokescreen, a way to pad time while people figured out how to pivot. He didn't need comfort. He needed respect. Carmen set up her laptop without being asked, opening a spreadsheet that detailed the company's quarterly earnings, showing not just profit but reinvestment, payroll expansions, and municipal partnerships. The banker leaned in, nodding slowly, his previous assumptions crumbling under the weight of the numbers. Then Luis spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but with clarity. He talked about how small businesses like Mateo's were the backbone of the city, how they brought real jobs, not just gig work, and how the city had already allocated new landscaping projects to Mateo's team based on their excellent track record. It was a clean, unforced pressure, one that didn't threaten, but made clear that the bank was no longer assessing just a loan. They were evaluating their own standing in the community. And the unspoken message was simple. Deny him now, and you're not just questioning a businessman. You're questioning an entire ecosystem that had grown around him. Mateo let them talk. He had said everything he needed to say the last time. This was about follow-through, about seeing whether the bank would act based on logic or continue to operate on something else, something more insidious. He could feel the shift again. The banker's questions were different now. Not about risk, but about opportunity. Not about whether the business was viable, but whether Mateo would consider moving all his accounts to their institution. A few forms were brought in, printed, signed, scanned. It was done quickly, efficiently. The same process that had dragged and stalled before now moved like clockwork. The credit line was approved on the spot, with terms more generous than Mateo had expected. There was talk of preferred client status, of long-term partnerships, of growth incentives. Mateo listened but did not react. He knew better than to be flattered by sudden enthusiasm. It wasn't admiration. It was correction. Outside the glass office, a few staff members pretended not to watch. But their glances betrayed them. They weren't used to seeing men like Mateo at the center of deals like these. They weren't used to seeing someone walk in wearing worn leather boots and walk out with more leverage than any of them had ever wielded. That's what made them look twice. That's what made them remember. When the meeting ended, they stood up together. The banker extended his hand again, this time with more sincerity. Mateo shook it without hesitation. But before he left, he paused for just a second and looked around. Not with pride, not with bitterness, but with precision. He wanted to mark this moment, to absorb it into the long mental ledger he had been building all his life. Not for revenge, for memory. Outside, the sun was warmer than it had been a week earlier. The street was buzzing with traffic, people heading to lunch, to meetings, to errands. Carmen adjusted her sunglasses and asked if they should stop by the office to file the final paperwork. Luis clapped him on the back and said he'd see him at the council meeting later that month. Mateo nodded, but his eyes lingered on the bank behind them. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something quieter, but deeper confirmation. All those years of effort, all those hours no one saw, the second jobs, the skipped holidays, the moments he questioned whether the struggle was worth it. It had brought him here, and he had stood firm. As they walked to the truck, a young man in a maintenance uniform passed by and gave Mateo a nod. Not one of recognition, but of respect. The kind of nod men give when they recognize the weight someone carries without needing to ask the story behind it. Mateo returned the gesture, then stepped into his truck and drove away, not as a man who had finally been seen, but as a man who no longer needed to be. The following month brought changes Mateo had not anticipated, not in terms of finances or business logistics, those he had prepared for, but in how the world around him began to respond. It began subtly. An email from the Chamber of Commerce inviting him to speak at a small business panel. A letter from the local high school asking if he might consider mentoring students interested in entrepreneurship. Even the city's business development department requested a meeting to discuss how his company could help shape new green spaces in underserved neighborhoods. These weren't requests that had ever come his way before. And they didn't come because someone had suddenly discovered him. They came because the illusion of invisibility had finally cracked. What no one saw, however, was the toll the journey had taken. Mateo's hands, steady and calloused, bore the years of physical labor. His back ached in the mornings from years of hauling tools before he could afford a crew. And while people now greeted him with handshakes and questions about growth strategy, none of them had been there when he ate beans and tortillas in the truck at night because every extra dollar went back into the business. No one asked about the years he spent cleaning yards alone, praying the old mower would last one more summer. But now people were watching. Young men who reminded him of his younger self, quiet, eager, too uncertain to raise their eyes in public spaces, began to approach him. They asked where to buy equipment, how to get licensed, how to build trust with customers who looked at them like hired help rather than professionals. Mateo never turned them away. He answered every question, pointed them towards city resources, even loaned tools from time to time. He didn't see it as charity. He saw it as insurance against the silence that had nearly swallowed his own beginnings. His shop grew too. He hired 2 more workers, both of them sons of immigrants like himself. One had dropped out of school to help support his family. The other had been laid off during the pandemic and struggled to find work since. Mateo didn't ask for polished resumes. He looked at their hands, their posture, their willingness to show up early. That was enough. In return, he paid them better than the going rate, trained them in everything from landscape design to client relations, and made sure they understood how to read the numbers, not just dig the soil. In the evenings, when the trucks were parked and the tools cleaned, Mateo would sit in the back office and review contracts by the faint light of the desk lamp. The room still smelled like motor oil and cut grass, but now it held framed certificates, thank you letters, and a growing stack of blueprints. He no longer dreamed about survival. Now he dreamed about scale, about how far he could push this, how many others he could bring with him, how many more quiet nods could turn into proud smiles. There were still moments, of course, when he walked into stores or offices and was mistaken for a delivery man. People still glanced at him twice when he paid with a business card that bore his name. He didn't correct them with words anymore. He let the pause that followed do the work. Sometimes the pause, just a heartbeat of confusion, was enough to plant a seed. His mother, who lived 3 states away, called him more frequently now. She didn't fully understand what he did. Her world was one of faith and family, not numbers and contracts, but she asked about his health, reminded him to eat, and prayed for him. Once she asked if he had finally made it. Mateo didn't know how to answer. What did it mean to make it? Was it when the bank manager shook his hand? Was it when the city council called him a community leader? Was it when a 17-year-old with a shy voice asked him how to open an LLC? He thought back to a day years ago when his truck had broken down on a dusty road outside El Paso. He had walked 5 miles in the heat with a gas can, wondering if he would even make rent that month. That night, he had slept in the cab of the truck, using his jacket as a pillow. No one knew. No one cared. But he had endured. And maybe that was it. Maybe making it wasn't about reaching a destination. Maybe it was about not quitting along the way. One Saturday, Mateo attended a local event where small business owners set up booths in the town square. Children ran through fountains. A local band played rancheras near the food trucks. Someone handed him a name tag, and beneath his name they had written Founder, Green Sun Landscaping. He pinned it on without much thought. But as he walked past booths and chatted with passers-by, he realized people were greeting him not as a stranger but as a presence, someone known, someone part of the fabric of the city. An older white man approached him near the gazebo. He looked vaguely familiar. After a moment, Mateo realized he was one of the other bankers, someone who had once offered him a flyer about basic checking accounts and told him the business lending specialist was unavailable that day. The man extended his hand and said he admired the growth of Mateo's company. There was no apology, no mention of the past. But Mateo saw it in the eyes, a recognition that had once been absent. He didn't hold resentment. It wasn't useful. What mattered more was what came next. Mateo shook the man's hand, then turned to greet a group of young men hovering near the edge of his booth. They were nervous, awkward, but curious. One of them had a sketchbook full of landscape designs. Another had a notebook filled with price estimates. Mateo smiled, pulled out a folding chair, and invited them to sit. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the plaza, he realized that the real power wasn't in bank approvals or contracts. It was in moments like this, in opening the door a little wider for the next one in line, in changing the story from one of quiet shame to quiet strength, and maybe one day, loud pride.